欢迎各位来到中间之声，中国和澳大利亚的播客访谈节目。此节目是从 2SAR 广播电台播出。今天的话题有关历史的记忆，我们会研究中澳关系的历史和澳大利亚200年以来的移民史。
Welcome to The Middle, the show where China and Australia talks and listens with a bit of help from their friends. We are coming to you from 2SER studios in the heart of Sydney on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. My name is Peter Fray, the co-director of the Centre for Media Transition, and joining me today is my co-presenter and esteemed colleague from the University of Technology, Sydney, Wanning Sun. Hello, Wanning. How are you today?
Pretty good today, Peter. Peter, I have a question for you to start with. Why did we decide to call this show The Middle?
Well, I'm so pleased you asked, Wanning. There are 4 important reasons for this. 1, Australia is increasingly called in the middle between the US and China. 2, China is, of course, the Middle Kingdom. And 3, many people get stuck in the middle of the debate about China and Australia. And we think there is a productive middle path in this often hot and divisive debate.
I can think of another reason.
Well, really, what's that?
Well, if you want to be philosophical about this, we can go with Aristotle's doctrine of the golden mean, or we can go with the Confucius idea of the middle way, 中庸之道, right?
That's very deep, Wanning. Very deep.
Well, today's episode is all about history. We're exploring the history of Sino-Australian relations and Chinese migration in Australia over the last 200 years. Joining us on the show today, we have Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to China, and Daphne Lowe Kelly, a community leader and a former president of Chinese Heritage Association. Steve and Daphne, welcome.
Thank you.
Perhaps I can jump in with the first question to you, Steve. When you went to China as the first Australian ambassador, what was it like? What was China like?
Empty.
Empty.
That seems a strange thing to say about a country which at the time had about 800 million people.
Yes.
But in Beijing, you could really shoot a cannon down the main street and you wouldn't hit anything. There was no traffic. There was nothing in the way of commercial enterprise, no signs, no colour.
So where were all the people?
The people, they get on the bus or their bicycle to go to work and then they go home again. But apart from that, you didn't see people. Well, if you went to a park on a festival day or national day or something like that, of course you'd see a lot of people there, or the zoo or something.
Right.
And it was also, for foreigners, very difficult to have communication with Chinese people. In fact, it was forbidden by the Chinese government.
Difficult for an ambassador. What year? You're talking about 1973, are we?
I went in early 73 and I left at the end of 76.
And what was the relationship like between Australia and China then?
Well, of course, we were putting it all together again. I have to say that, if we're talking about the history of Australia-China relations, there is a longer history that goes a long way back, and many Australians involved in the relationship, and many Australians of Chinese descent also. That's a very important part of the prior history. But if we're talking about the beginning of relations with the People's Republic of China, I've said often that it was like, because we'd had no relations for 23 years. So it was like putting a severed limb back together. You had to find all the nerve ends and connect them up. And whether it was people working in the Academy of Science or officials or sports people or whatever, it was challenging. You couldn't do anything like the kind of thing that you could do in China even 10 years later. Because they're still in the latter days of Mao's Cultural Revolution. There's a big internal power struggle going on, and officials felt very inhibited about taking or responding to initiatives.
So that was a very interesting metaphor that you used about the limb. Did you ever anticipate such a dramatic change in the Australians' political discourses about China?
towards the end of my time in Beijing, I wrote a formal dispatch to Canberra in which I said that after Mao dies, China will return to a kind of different state which Chinese people will be more familiar with. And that is, in fact, what happened. The politics and the ideology was, if not taken away completely, was pulled back. And Chinese people were given freedom to, well, later on, Deng Xiaoping said, to become rich. But actually, in my view, China is the quintessential materialist society. Mm-hmm. In other words, they never invented a god, a metaphysical god. They imported a couple, but so essentially material, not in a Marxist sense. Mm. And so when Chinese were given the opportunity to earn a living, to spend it how they wanted to, even to make a bit of money, they leapt into it. Mm. and so we kind of anticipated that from the embassy in 76. We wrote it, and everyone laughed. Everyone in Canberra.
Well, they would be laughing now. No. Daphne, let's turn to you. As a community leader and the former president of the Chinese Heritage Association, you've had a very interesting perspective on the struggles and the wins of Chinese migrants in Australia of the past 2 centuries. Not that you are 2 centuries old, I might add. What would you say? How would you characterise them? What would you say were some of the struggles for the Chinese migrant community in Australia?
Well, if you go back to the 1800s, and especially during the gold rush period, which was started around about 1852, now Chinese for the first time came in reasonable numbers, and they were then fairly visual, right, on the goldfields. Right. And unfortunately, they were not welcome. The non-Chinese, especially a whole range of different Europeans, were...
they were the other, weren't they?
They definitely were the others, because you've got to remember this was still during the Qing dynasty. Mm-hmm. The Chinese looked quite different. The men would still have had their queues or their pigtails. They didn't speak, majority of them just spoke no English. They ate different foods. So they were quite different. And unfortunately, as a result of that, the first anti-Chinese legislation to limit the number of Chinese coming to Australia was enacted in 1855 by the colonial Victorian government. So from that beginning of where there was a number of and there were attacks also, right, on the Chinese. So there
was a very material and physical struggle then around those times, right?
Yes. And most of the people who came, of course, were men. There were no Chinese women around that time, but that led on right through that whole period, right, let's say going up to 1901 with Federation, that most of the colonial powers enacted anti-Chinese legislation. It also happened in New South Wales after the so-called Lambing Flat riots of 1861. And then, of course, what happened? You get Federation, and you get the Immigration Restriction Act, or the White Australia policy.
Yes, recently, now talking about White Australian policy, Daphne, I know that New York Times did a story to mark the 200 years of migration, Chinese migration to Australia, and you and your family were actually featured in that story.
A very nice picture.
Yeah, very nice picture of you wearing a nice red dress. I noticed that you were quoted in that story as saying that you think some of the Chinese people in the Chinese communities were fearing that some of the shades of the White Australian policy are coming back. Do you think these kind of fears are justified?
Well, I think over the last 2 years or so, especially with this whole foreign influence policy that the current government have been pushing, I think starting with donations, right, and stamp dastiari. So And a lot of that rhetoric that has been going on does certainly influence a lot of people. And there's probably 1.2, maybe to 1.4 million people here in Australia of Chinese descent. Now, those 1.4 million come from a wide background, right, ranging from, descendants of the early Chinese, right through to, ones who've come from Southeast Asian countries, and, of course, to the most recent lot who are now from the
People's
PRC.
Republic of China.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Steve, in a similar vein, I think you've been doing quite a lot of work with Linda Jacobson at China Matters. And you recently put out a policy brief which argued, in essence, that there is a real problem with with Australia's China narrative. So maybe you could sort of expand on that a bit. What's the problem? And dare I ask, how should it be fixed?
That's a slightly longer answer.
Yes, than this show, perhaps. But anyway.
Yeah, but just taking up where Daphne left off, I mean, part of the reason for us putting out that paper, this is Linda Jacobson, who started this thing, China Matters, of which I'm the chairman of the board, and was this growing tide of anti-China sentiment in the mainstream English language media, but also being fed by certain agencies of the Commonwealth Government in selective leaks to chosen journalists and so on, to crank the whole thing up so that it was about our relations with China, and the allegations of China trying to take over Australia and washing into the whole question of Chinese Australians.
So is that a domestic narrative? Is that, do you think, in essence?
It's a mix. For the politicians, a lot of it is about the domestic constituency. But for those agencies, it's more of an ideological position, reflecting the views of their counterparts in Washington about China. So the view of these agencies, same agencies in Washington, is that China is a threat, and now we see virtually declared as the enemy without actually using that term. And this is reflected in our own intelligence and security agencies. So what Linda and I wrote was to say that the narrative, to the extent that there was a narrative about China, and we have to be very clear about this because the governments for some time have never attempted to set out a long view of what they think about this change, this enormous giant power that is there in our midst, and how over the next 10, 20, 30 years we're going to manage it. For better or for worse, it's there.
It's not going away.
It's not going away. So to the extent that there was a narrative, it was a dated narrative that was very much driven by United States views, containment of China. You could live in that view. You could live with China so long as it didn't become too uppity.
Yes.
But now we have China uppity, as it were.
Yep.
And there is no narrative from the government as to how we're going to deal with that. So that's what it's about.
So the question of how it should be fixed is really even possibly too presumptuous almost, because it doesn't seem to be the appetite for a fix.
Well, I think Linda and I have come to the conclusion that we will have to write the narrative.
You too. Excellent. Okay.
Not
a few others.
Not entirely on our own. But what we're saying is if we do a draft, if we have some brainstorming sessions with people from all over, different views, that don't all have to be favourable to China or whatever, and from different sectors, including particularly those who are very engaged with the relationship, and that includes business, but not only business, many civil society actors, all kinds.
A broad debate.
Yeah. So, and we synthesised that into a draft paper. So I'm talking now about process, not
yes,
yet
yes.
about content.
Yeah, yep.
And that draft paper is then put out for discussion, for development into something that can be a China narrative, which we would hope becomes accepted by government and opposition.
Right.
So it has to be that good.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're listening to The Middle, the show that's about exploring relations between China and Australia. Today we're joined in the studio by Australia's first ambassador to China, Stephen Fitzgerald, and Daphne Low-Kelly, a community leader and former president of the Chinese Heritage Association. Peter.
And I might give a quick mention to our esteemed producer, Amy Ma, who's doing a wonderful job putting this wonderful show together. Thanks, Wanning. Daphne, your family history and its relationship to Australia is full of detours and complications. That's possibly not an unusual narrative in one sense. But so your father had to go to New Zealand. Why was that?
Well, my first recorded relative actually came to Australia. That was my maternal grandfather, my mother's father.
Right.
He came, and I haven't been able to establish the exact date, but I believe it was in the 1890s. And he then became a market gardener, right, in the Camden district.
Right.
However, when my father wanted to come to this part of the world in 1920, of course, the White Australia policy was in place. So what he did was he managed to get a passage to New Zealand. And New Zealand also did have a dictation test. And in actual fact, Father, on his first but that dictation test was in English, unlike here in Australia, where they could give it to you in any European language. So in other words, you were deemed to always fail here.
Right.
So Father, for the first time, didn't pass that test, but he tried again in 1921, and he passed the dictation test, and then there was the problem of a head tax. At that time, it was £100.
Wow, a lot of money.
A lot of money. Now, Father doesn't have that sort of money, but what they used to do was someone from the same county would lend that money,
I see.
and then Father would work it off. So
he ended up in New Zealand, though.
So he ends up in New Zealand.
I see.
Later on, he actually has an arranged marriage, right, and marries my mother,
Who is in
China.
Is in China.
She's also from the same district. We come from the district of, in Cantonese it's Jiangxing, or in Mandarin it's Denzhen. They come from different villages, right? My mother comes from a village with the surname of Zhong, and they're married, and then what was fairly typical was she then goes to live in with her mother-in-law in Father's village, and Father goes back to New Zealand, right, to try and earn a living to support the family.
What was your father doing in New Zealand?
He mainly he was a salesman, and then he also went into the fruit and vegetable game, mainly in the retail area,
Right.
and but then Father, for the first 10 years of their marriage, they lived apart, right? But when they had enough, when Father had enough funds, he would travel back to China, and so I know obviously on two of these visits, my oldest brother was born in one of those visits, and my older sister, right, was born on another. Then 10 years later, Mother manages to get to New Zealand.
Right.
And so 5 of us New Zealand-born, right.
Oh, so you're a Kiwi as well as...
So I'm a Kiwi by
Australian.
birth.
Right.
Yes, so when people ask me where am I from, you know, it's quite a difficult one. So I normally say I'm a Kiwi by birth, I'm a resident Australian, and I'm Chinese by descent.
And that story you just related to talks a lot about the richness of the relationship, but also, again, about the struggle, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
this sort of often unheard of and documented, well, better documented these days, but the struggle to better themselves, right? Is that what motivated your family, your father?
Oh, definitely. Back then, our father, he unfortunately lost his father when he was quite young. And so even at the age of 13, he went with a village uncle to the island of Sumatra, which was part of the Dutch East Indies back then. That village uncle happened to be a tailor. So Father worked there for a few years, But because conditions were so primitive, he decided there must be somewhere better to go. So eventually he went back to China, and then at about the age of 18 or 19, he got this passage to New Zealand.
The answer was New Zealand.
Yes, but look, all of those early Chinese struggled, right? It was never easy. There was, you've got to also remember that the majority of them, unlike the ones today, came from the villages. Yes. And so they were, but a lot of them had no formal education, but they were all willing to work hard, and they came from, because they had people and families that they needed to support. And back there, China had lots of internal problems.
Yes, okay. Very interesting.
Yeah. Steve, I have another question for you. When you were being the ambassador to China, you predicted, didn't you, that one day China was going to become a dominant power in the region? What led you to that conclusion?
As I mentioned earlier, I think that there's a combination of elements in Chinese society that made it very responsive to the incentives of materialism. That's part of it. But part of it is also the work ethic and the extraordinary esteem in which education is held in Chinese society. Some people describe this in part as being Confucian, and to an extent that's right, but it's a combination of factors, some of which go all the way back to Confucius. But a few years ago, a scholar by the name of Cam Louis wrote a book called Theorizing Chinese Masculinity, and in which he went back and examined all of the texts that you could find, the histories, and then when you start to get fiction and all of this kind of stuff. And a main conclusion that he came to was that the idea of masculinity, the first quality was to be educated, as reflected in the written record of China. So, and that is deep in the Chinese psyche, I believe. So you have that, you have the materialism, you have, to some extent, the Confucian idea of order, the filial idea, and the discipline, if you like, that goes with that, the togetherness of communities. And so our view from the embassy, my view was that if you remove all of these artificial layers that have been put on top of Chinese society by communism, by Mao, and I'm not denying that the revolution, the communist revolution, didn't do some good things. It did. And we must remember that. But it also did some bad things, some really bad things. So once you took all of that off, this would release an enormous energy. And so we forecast that by the turn of the century, China could be having growth rates of 10%.
So when you made that forecast, how did the Australian government respond to that?
Well, the bureaucrats in Canberra, I mean, we could almost hear the laughing from when we were there in Beijing. It was so loud. But this was written at a time of change of government. Whitlam was out. I had been appointed by Whitlam, of course, and Fraser had come in. And this dispatch that I wrote was intended for Fraser and his foreign minister, Andrew Peacock. And when they came to Beijing on a state visit in the middle of 1976, I had an opportunity to talk them through some of these arguments. And they accepted the arguments. So when you could get to them personally, to an extent that one of the arguments in a separate dispatch, I said, we've got to put a huge effort into cultural relations with China. We've got to have that underpinning. Otherwise, we won't know anything about China. We'll be ignorant, and we won't be able to manage it when it becomes this big giant. So they went back, and within months, they took to Cabinet a proposal to establish what became the Australia-China Council, which has done an enormous amount over the 40 years since to stimulate cultural and educational and scientific exchanges.
Just a further question on that. Did you detect a time when the attitude of those bureaucrats who you heard laughing when you were in Beijing, when that changed? Was there a key moment, or was that a gradual sort of accretion of change? Did it was there a moment where bureaucrats went, oh, that Fitzgerald guy, he actually was onto something?
I don't know that they ever said that to
they
themselves or to anyone else.
They probably wouldn't.
But I think it was more gradual. I think there was a generational thing. I think, going back to the question of white Australia, at the time you still had people in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade who are out and out racists, and who were also so disparaging of Australian culture. They believed themselves
the Little Brits.
Little Brits.
Yeah, Little Brits, yeah.
So as that generation passed, then the turmoil of the 70s led into the Hawke government, and I think Hawke was inspirational in that regard in getting people out of those mental moulds.
Yes, of course. So you're listening to The Middle with me, Peter Frey, and our Walling Sun. Our guest today are Steve Fitzgerald, the first Australian ambassador to China in the 1970s, and Daphne Lowe Kelly, the Chinese Australian community leader. This has been a very interesting history lesson. I'm learning things by the second here. Wanning, we've got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I have a question for Daphne. Daphne, when you were the former president of the Chinese Heritage Association, you did a lot of work recording histories of the Chinese migrants. Why do you think it's important to keep telling stories about this history?
Because the history of the settlement of the Chinese here in Australia is part of Australian history. And virtually there's been nothing recognising that. So it became very important. There were some academics who were starting to do some research, people who were doing either PhDs on certain topics. But what I was also very interested in was that the Chinese Australians themselves should be looking at their own histories and recording that, and also not only for themselves but for wider distribution. So through the Chinese Heritage Association, now that was formed in 2002, but also at the same time there was another organisation formed also by the community called the Chinese Australian Historical Society. And funnily enough, I'm the current vice president of that group. Looks as though they...
You're a glutton for punishment.
Yes, I'd like to say no, but they keep on asking me, right? And so what has actually happened, we do regular programs, talks, right? These could be from members of the community who have done research, people who have published books. And one of the other things that we are doing is that we're linking in with other associations. So, for example, we've had talks to do with actually possibly the first Chinese Australian lawyer, a chap called Otto Con Sing. Now, that particular talk, we linked it in with the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, and a barrister by the name of Malcolm Oates actually had done that research and gave that talk. We also have worked in here with the UTS and ACRI, that in their history series have found a number of speakers, for them there. So this is really important, and I think also not only for the broader Australian Chinese, but a lot of the recent Chinese who've come here don't know anything about the difficulties that the early Chinese had to go through in order for them, to have a much easier time now.
Talking about difficulties, but that you must also have come across a lot of success, good stories. People who have worked really hard and made it. Do you have some examples you can share with us about people doing well?
Definitely. There are a number of... What the early Chinese did was, and we mentioned earlier, how important education was. So we have had in the community, education was important, and so you have people like Victor Chang, right? The first
heart surgeon,
heart transplant, right? Doctor. You have people like John Yu, who was the Australian of the Year in 1996 and has had a number of other, right?
And Eddie Wu, the math teacher.
Yes, and currently Eddie
Such
Wu,
a cool guy.
Yes, a young Chinese Australian who is making a name right in the education area. There are now. I don't think that in the sporting area, not so many, although one of the things that I do see now is that because there are certain areas like gymnastics, water polo, and other areas where there's a number of Chinese coaches or people who are from China who are now working, right, in those areas. And myself, I became a teacher, right? I thought, well, education is important, and I was actually the first of my family to go to university and to get a degree. But then all the younger ones followed, and so, they all became dentists. And so amongst
Doctors
all my,
and
nieces and nephews, I think we've got just about every profession. And I think it's quite interesting because when I mentioned my father could not pass the English test when he arrived. Well, one of his grandsons topped the New Zealand exams in English and Latin.
That's what a wonderful positive note. And I think as the middle continues, we're going to hear a lot more of those success stories as well as some of the great context we've had from our guests today. That just about wraps it up for this edition, and I'd very much like to thank Steve Fitzgerald. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And Daphne Lowe Kelly for your great insights and wisdom. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank our producer Amy Ma. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, Peter Frey, and Wanning Sun, my wonderful co-presenter.
See you next time.
Yes, thank you so much for listening.